Nippert Dharma Talks.
Talk 4, 17th of June 2012, Right Livelihood. Professor Geoffrey Hunt talks about mindful work and mindfulness at work.
We're going to talk about right livelihood. That's where we've reached in following the Noble Eightfold Path. Right livelihood we could also conceive as right work. The word right is a little bit troublesome. Let's think of it as helpful or mindful work. We all spend a great deal of our lives working, and we tend to think of it now as something separate from the rest of our lives. So there's work and there's life. At one time, of course, people just didn't think in that way. Work was life and life was work, but we tend to separate them off. One way that we do this is to distinguish also between leisure and work. And I suppose we tend to think that we work in order to have leisure or pleasure. This is rather a curious way of thinking, actually, historically speaking. What if instead we were to find fulfillment in our work? And what if our leisure and our fulfillment was a form of work? After all, what is work? Well, work has taken many different forms in different societies. There were hunter-gatherers. In our past, we were all hunter-gatherers running around in the bush with spears to small animals and collecting berries. That's what the human race was doing, actually, for millions of years. Was that work? They didn't think of it as something separate. There were slave societies in the ancient world, the Romans, the Greeks, the Babylonians, entirely based on slavery. Look what's happened to work there. Masses of people treated as property, having to work in order to maintain another class of people. Then, of course, we have our modern society, which we tend to think of as normal and natural, which is a society based on the sale of labor as a commodity in the marketplace. And maybe there are other forms of society, and who knows where we will be in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time? Who knows? I think one thing we can be sure of is that work will be transformed into something else. The Buddha says that we are dissatisfied and bewildered creatures. Now, this is very evident in our work. A recent survey by a reputable company asked people whether they were happy in their work. Did a very large sample of people, and only 20% were prepared to say they were happy in their work in this country. The other 80% were either indifferent or said they were not happy in their work. It's food for thought there, isn't there? They all also asked them why they were unhappy and what would make them happy. And they said the most important thing in being happy at work was having some sense of being valued, of belonging to a friendly, open environment in which people could communicate with each other and in which they knew what was expected of them, so that there was communication from those leading the organization, good communication. In other words, it was a sense of belonging and common purpose. And when they didn't feel that, or when they felt undervalued or just used, then they weren't happy at their work. It's also food for thought, isn't it? What's the connection between this and mindfulness? This is what we want to think about. The Buddha did say a lot about work, and what he has to say goes back, we're talking about the original teachings of the Buddha. What we find about livelihood in Buddhist teachings are not an afterthought. We might think, surely the Buddha just sat under a tree meditating, didn't he? And we come here only to meditate. Why should we pay any attention to the issue of work? Well, let's ask ourselves why the Buddha would have paid attention to it. Why in the most ancient writings is he actually addressing the issue of work? He is generally talking to ordinary people rather than monks, but it has application to everyone. And it's come down to us as this idea of right livelihood. Now, the Buddha lived in a very different society from our own. Probably quite hard to imagine how different it would have been. It wasn't as though people of that time were like us but had less. They thought and felt differently from us. So it is rather difficult to put ourselves in their mindset. Certainly they didn't have industry, they didn't have corporations, they didn't have banks, they didn't have cars, and they didn't put a man on the moon. It's a largely rural society. And there were some forms of slavery actually, but not systematic in the Buddhist society. More like domestic slavery or paying off a debt. And the Buddha did say something about that. What did the Buddha have to say about specific things? As a guide, there could be a guide for us. Well, he said there are certainly 4 things which are not mindful work, and which we should consider. And these are, first of all, any kind of trading in living or sentient beings. He wasn't just talking about human beings, but living beings, sentient beings. Trading in them, treating them as objects. So again, when we think of the food industry as it's presently set up, it doesn't really seem to accord with what the Buddha was teaching. Because here we are treating animals as objects and not with any great deal of respect. We don't see how they are like us or we are like them. And it is doing a huge amount of harm to ourselves and our health and to our environment. He also said trading in human beings is something that should give us cause for concern. You might think, well, that's not very relevant these days, is it? I suppose he was talking, for one, about slavery, trading in human beings. But we can also think of trafficking in human beings, which is actually a major issue today. We can think of trafficking in young people or even children for sexual purposes. That still goes on quite a large scale. In fact, it has been estimated that there are over 12 million people who are, technically speaking, slaves, right here and now in this day and age. Depends on your definition of slave, of course, but if you have no freedom to move where you want, to give up your job, and you are forced, sometimes under threat of violence, to continue the work, then you are a slave. Forced labor exists now. 12 million people are subjected to it. On a slightly broader definition of slavery, the figure is probably twice as much as that. Here in England, believe it or not, slavery exists. Go to the Anti-Slavery Society's website and you will find that there are domestic slaves, for example, and there are workshops where people are held against their will. So the Buddha was writing, well, he wasn't writing, he was speaking. Other people wrote down what he had to say. 2,400 years ago, you might think, how could what he has to say about livelihood be relevant? Some of it is relevant, but there's a lot that we have to think about which he didn't have to think about in relation to corporations, banks, the environment, and so on. If he was talking about slavery, we cannot kid ourselves that slavery has ended. Mauritania in Africa was the last country, only a few years ago, to sign an international agreement that slavery would be illegal. That's only a few years ago. But because something has been made illegal doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It continues, and it continues everywhere, and there are good people working against it everywhere. The third thing that he pointed out was that trading in armaments or arms or weapons cannot be a good thing for anybody. It is not good for the person who does it, and it's not good for the people who receive it, and for what happens with it. Because after all, armaments have one clear purpose. It is to kill. And we've talked about ahimsa, or the principle of non-harm before. Let's start where we are. The second largest corporation in the world making, selling armaments is British. It's BAE Systems. In terms of exporting armaments all around the world, where does Britain stand? We are number 5. We are the 5th largest exporter of weapons around the world, if we look at it over a 10-year period. The United States is number 1. This was not the sort of world the Buddha was living in, is it? But clearly, if he talked about armaments, he saw it as an issue then. And it's an issue now. And how much have we learned? Well, there are good people, NGOs, all sorts of organizations, which every day are trying to draw attention to arms trade and do something about it. But most of us don't know very much about it at all. And we also feel that we don't have any responsibility for it. There's something to think about there. Do we have any responsibility? And if so, what can we do about it? Or is it just part of the human condition and is ineradicable? We can't do anything about it. At least we can think about this issue. And the fourth one that the Buddha mentioned was trade in intoxicants and poisons. And it's quite clear what he was talking about. Alcohol has been around since the Babylonian times, and it was around in the Buddha's time. Alcohol, cigarettes, all the way up to cocaine, heroin, all of these things are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. And you don't need me to say that they are self-destructive and harmful. They were an issue in his time, they are an issue in our time. What does this mean? Does this mean we can't move from where we are? We are stuck in a rut? We are just bad? We are just evil and we can't move out of this? Or those of us who perhaps have goodwill think, well, I am powerless, there's nothing that I can do about it. These are difficult questions, but they are questions that we need more than ever to think about because we live in a very tightly knit world of 7 billion people. So we need to think about these issues. If you take the issue, the first one, of trading in living beings, well, we are reaching a point where not only are we actually exterminating by our own activity within the next 30 or 40 years over a quarter of all species on the planet, but we are thereby undermining the conditions of our own lives, our own existence. So something as humble as plankton in the ocean, which you probably never heard of or you don't think about. They absorb carbon dioxide because phytoplankton are plants. They absorb that carbon dioxide, is now causing us a problem. They produce oxygen, and yet they're in deep, deep trouble because of pollution and because of climate change. One recent alarming report shows that as much as perhaps 30 or 40% of our phytoplankton have disappeared in the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's worrying. This shows us interdependence. It's all very well to say, well, it doesn't really matter if we lose a species of butterfly or a little green frog in the Amazonian jungle. Does it matter? I've never seen it. It doesn't do anything for me. And yet through our work in large organizations, little by little, indirectly, it all adds up over the decades to self-destruction. What is the answer? We need knowledge. We need awareness of our own nature as it is at the moment. Without the awareness, there is no way forward. And if there's one thing that the Buddha teaches, it's awareness. Know thyself. As Socrates also taught, who was a contemporary in Greece of the Buddha. The Buddha suggested a few other things about work, which, to sum them all up, was one, deceitfulness in work or by work, that we end up harming ourselves through deceitfulness. And yet we can ask whether we have an economy that's based on deceitfulness. Isn't there deceit everywhere, in advertising, in products? Very significantly, for this issue around banks and credit, the Buddha questioned usury. Usury is lending money at an interest. He thought that that was unfair and will lead to trouble. Of course, there are other religions and spiritualities that have also questioned it. There was a time when Christianity questioned it, said it was wrong, and then gave up on that. Islam, to this day, says usury is wrong. Islamic banks do not take interest. What they do is that they lend money on the promise of a share of the profits of that company. So they're partners with the company, but they're not expecting interest on the loan, and they don't say, if the company collapses, you've still got to pay me the debt. It's a different principle. There is hope. There are different ways of doing things. And the whole idea of an economy that is not based on interest is a live issue today. In Sweden, a bank called JAK Bank has been set up without interest. It doesn't sell interest and it doesn't take interest. Interesting idea, isn't it? Because we think, how could things possibly be otherwise? Of course, things can always be otherwise. Things can be radically otherwise. But that depends on us, on our awareness, our knowledge, and our willingness to make our own little tiny difference to things, the little things we can do. We can't change everything, but we can change something. And when we change it, when we add up all those little somethings, they add up to something very big. So the Buddha's teaching on right livelihood is very relevant today. I want to make a little distinction, which I think is important, between mindfulness at work and mindful work. Well, they sound the same, but when I thought about this, I thought there is really a difference. Mindfulness at work means you go to work, whatever it is. You don't really question the social consequences or the social role of that work, but you're mindful in doing the work. You're mindful when you're picking up the pen. You're mindful when you're writing in the accounts ledger. You're mindful in the way you speak to people politely, etc. You're mindful in doing the work. But you never ask yourself, work for what? What's the social consequence of this work? Is it harmful? And that is the difference between the Buddha society and ours. His was simple. When I worked, I could see the consequences of the work. And if I did harm, I could see the consequences of the harm. Our society is not like that. We can all be good people as individuals, and when we put it all together, collectivize it in huge organizations, huge harm is done. How do we get a grip on that? Well, to start with, we have to be aware of it. An organization that is doing tremendous harm can be made up entirely of good, decent people. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's actually true. How do we move beyond that blockage? Through mindful work. Mindful work is not the same as being mindful at work. Mindful work means I'm questioning, what is the point of this work? Is this helpful work to living beings and to human beings and so on, and to the environment? Or is it the opposite? If it's the opposite, I'm left with a question. It's not for anyone to say, you have to change your job. It's for each one of us to ask, is there something else I could do with my energy, my effort, my talents, that perhaps isn't so destructive? I've asked myself that question, and I've made my own decisions, and I don't ask anyone to judge me, and I'm not here to judge anyone either. It's a question. The Buddha liked questions. He just throws questions at people. Questions can be revolutionary. The answers are yours. It's a mistake to think one can impose answers on people. That also is a problem. But one can ask questions, and then you can make of it what you like. What would mindful work or mindfulness at work look like? With mindfulness at work, we would be mindful in everything we're doing during the day, trying to get on with our colleagues rather than backbiting. Isn't there always a strong temptation in the coffee break to get together with a couple of colleagues and start grumbling about the manager? We all do that, don't we? It's such fun, isn't it? If you ever become a manager, you find it's a rather different situation. It's not easy being a manager either. And managers are getting together and they're having a grumble about the staff. What's going on here? It should be possible to have this thing which in the survey came out as an open, communicative workplace. But mindful work is a little bit more difficult. It requires understanding how this world works. It requires understanding that each one of us is one of 7 billion people that are organized in different ways to do things. And we don't really understand what those things are and what their effects are. Because when they collectivize them, when we accumulate them and put them all together over a long period, the consequences can be disastrous. If they're not disastrous for us now, they'll be disastrous for our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. We need desperately to expand our minds, both our knowledge and our awareness. Not judgments on other people, awareness of ourselves and what we are doing in our work. We don't just tolerate or put up with our work in order to pay for a holiday. We do that, and I've done it. But think more deeply. Does it all add up? Probably not. Just think about that. So right livelihood is an issue. It raises lots of questions. And surely it should be possible to be generous and helpful in one's work, to be grateful for one's work. Those things should be possible. And I believe they are possible. But each one of us can make a little difference by being more knowledgeable and more aware. Because mindfulness does not begin and end by sitting on a cushion. Perhaps it begins and ends at work.
New Buddha Way approaches meditation as a way of life, letting go of East and West, past and future, and starting afresh here and now. To find out more, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.